when it comes to career choices and skills changes. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, not so much reflecting on the last recession, but I think in terms of looking forward, I think we want to be cognizant about just the opportunity for folks to retrain and reskill and to be able to enter back at a strata from maybe roles that have been contracted or jobs that have been contracted. How can we use this as an opportunity perhaps to kind of reset where's our people of color and people who've had high barriers in the past, maybe how could we reset some opportunity for them by having them have more access to training that would help them meet the new jobs that are going to be coming our way. I mean, really, most jobs at kind of those entry levels where we've tended to find folks who are people of color end up, they need to, those jobs aren't going to look the same, and they're going to need new skills and new abilities to even have those jobs. But then I would just argue, let's try to find a way so that they can even do better than that, right? I mean, we need to think about how we as a community don't end up with, and I'm sure, Tawana, you've heard this term of this racial paradox where, are around this COVID situation where our people of color tend to work these essential jobs with higher risks, and they're also the first ones to get laid off. I mean, I think this idea of where they sit currently in our economic and workforce strata, it just shouldn't be acceptable anymore. And so we need to find a path out of that as a community, and it's going to take a lot of thinking around how to do that. So I don't know if that's somewhat helpful.
Really good, Ling. Any other thoughts or reactions?
I guess this is Trista Mattis Castillo. I just want to go back to Max's comments because the community I represent is the most racially diverse and lowest socioeconomic class in Ramsey County. And what we saw after the last recession, when some communities, the neighborhoods of color where they were homeowners, they lost their homes, many lost their homes, and then investors, even local landlords came in and bought them and then forced those same individuals to become renters where they're no longer controlling rent. Simultaneously, we had light rail and other investments happening, and so we're seeing a gentrification that it was contributed to by the last recession, and I'm very concerned about that same thing happening again, even at a wider scale, as the recovery has been very slow as it is to become homeowners, and how that happens again with those folks who are profiting during a pandemic that will have the opportunity to then purchase homes that go to quick sale or foreclosure very quickly, and then forcing those folks to become renters and not holding that rent line.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'd also add that the recession really stalled all new development. And so when the economy really reopened, we saw that the supply was super constrained. And so I wonder, I'd be interested in seeing strategies that continue to provide new supply on the lower economic ends of the scale during the recession, so that when things reopen, low-income people don't lose out as on the housing front.
Cool.
Any others? Are you all seeing anything out in communities, in neighborhoods, any either solutions that you think may not be rising up to the institutional level that would cause us to solve differently, or immediate needs that you think are being missed by the solutions that are being put forward?
One of the things I have in my community, we have a housing development that has all people of color in that community, and they're working to form a cooperative so that they can purchase it from the current landlord and become the owners. And so working in cooperative together collectively in a community. And I think this is something that isn't super popular, but maybe a solution, especially for our communities of color that might not have the longevity of work history because of the type of work that they have had. And now with the pandemic, you know, loss of job, and then credit is based on work history and how we do that. And so thinking about how in some communities, whether it be apartments or townhomes or row homes or neighborhoods, how it can be a cooperative agreement and investment.
Yeah, Tawana, I would just say one thing. I know you guys have led in that I would like to see us continue to push ourselves in, even though it feels like we don't have a lot of bandwidth and this could sort of easily fall to the sidelines, but I feel like it's just as important is the work around the data deaggregation. I feel like that's an area that it would be easily be overlooked here, but I think there is that opportunity for that last bullet around, you know, systematic impact here, because I mean, I think that work was just starting to bubble up in our community to sort of understand our communities more specifically. I know around, you know, I've been doing some work with the East African community or the Asian community. I mean, they aren't these big buckets that systems have put them in. And I worry that as we measure kind of the impact or try to turn levers around supporting groups, we don't fully understand the differences between those groups. So
I don't know if we're going to have, or if we've really considered what we can do in terms of the tools that the county and the cities may have, such as ordinances, etc. But as was stated, there's a lot of outside investment. There's not necessarily any rent controls or ability to protect home ownership as investment happens in communities due to rising taxes and things of that nature. My understanding is in other cities there are tax reduction or holding policies for residents who have lived in the community for a long time. So if you look around the stadium for United, the Midway area, you know, is it possible to hold taxes for the residents who have owned properties in those communities so that all of a sudden they're not priced out due to rising property taxes? What could be done to set rent control, sometimes viewed as a very negative term, but having its place so that people can still have affordable rents. And there are many programs throughout the country that actually promote home ownership. How could we be more intentional at looking at those? So I think in addition to the conversation that we're having, what best practices have been deployed across the country that we can bring here and set as a target to implement several of those before the year end, so that we are putting some stopgaps in place and helping to potentially stop the tide of rising housing and lack of affordable housing.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again for your insights. This is really helpful for us as a team. Our team has been taking notes frantically to capture them all, but we would love to continue to have these conversations and open to them. So you, Tawana and Carrie, are very accessible as well as the rest of the team to continue to have this conversation as we move along, so that we can align and continue to move forward and position the county for recovery. So thank you all for that. I do want to shift gears just a bit before we get into housing to talk about community engagement. To Tawana's earlier question about what's happening on the ground, we do want to make sure throughout this process that we are really reaching those people who wouldn't normally participate in a planning process to get that particular insight of what's happening, what's been their experience, both in housing, both in seeking for jobs or any other area. So I'm going to punt this over to Denitric Powers of NAO Partners, who will provide you a bit of an update on what we're doing in terms of community engagement.
Thank you, Josh. Good afternoon, everyone. Due to COVID-19, we have had to shift gears, trying to find digital solutions of how to reach Ramsey County stakeholders. Unfortunately, everything happened so fast that we just had to move as best that we could. And we feel like we have found a very good web-based solution that still allows us to achieve our goals and intentions of building context, understanding, and prioritizing those who traditionally aren't included. Just as a reminder, really quick, of how our engagement will inform our work. It'll inform our work pre and post our community build sessions, with the community build sessions acting as kind of our center of gravity towards implementation. Prior to our community build sessions, our community engagement is built around helping supplement and validate our baseline understanding of the data and what we have heard from our project partners, as well as reading reports, but also adding meaningful context in order to refine and prioritize our solutions and strategies that will be generated out of our build sessions. Post the build sessions, we want to continue supporting our understanding of the ecosystem, trying to gain a better understanding of the grassroots resources and partners across our 4 focus areas, while also building a consensus and leaders in order to champion the plan after its final stages in order to see it through towards implementation. This is a quick timeline of our engagement components, kind of like major milestones. Again, our build session is happening in July. Between now and July, gaining, validating our information, collecting data. In June, we plan on having some community kickoff webinars in order to engage with the community based on some of the input and strategies that come out of our working group sessions that'll happen right at the beginning of June. And then after our build sessions, also having further community briefings. And digital media engagement will continue throughout the entire project, folding that data in as we get it. Next slide. One of the digital solutions that we feel will be very helpful to this project will be the web-based platform Social Pinpoint. Social Pinpoint, we decided on this as a way to manage our communications with a variety of stakeholders, but also in order to use some of its benefits of some of the multiple engagement tools and reporting aspects of this platform as well. Some of the benefits of Social Platform is its ability to house data as well as collect data and reports directly on a web-based platform, all in one singular area. Another benefit includes the variety of engagement tools that we'll be using, which includes surveys, forums, interactive maps for collecting data as well as reporting data, as well as virtual town halls, which gives us the ability to integrate with Zoom so that stakeholders can engage directly through the platform instead of having to download a third-party application, which can sometimes be difficult for others. Thank you, Karen McKay, for I'm getting into that. Another benefit of it is its ability to translate into multiple other languages using integration of Google Translate services. This would be very helpful. All the information that we put onto the website, that we type into the website, users will be able to go and translate that information into the respective language. One of the limitations is the fact that it is a digital platform. So of course, we won't be able to meet everyone, but that's why we'll be still working with community partners and grassroots organizations that are still engaging with their communities. We plan on launching this platform sometimes around the middle of May, hopefully the 2nd or 3rd week.
Cool. Thank you, Denitric. I just want to underscore one of Denitric's points, which is around partnership. That an approach to engagement is kind of leveraging existing assets and resources and tools that are already available to you all as you all are engaging with your constituents and those whom you serve. So we want to build this platform that can kind of build off of those already existing efforts. So as we continue to roll out this plan, we will keep you all informed and updated on what's to come, so you can share those resources with your networks as we move along, and we can just continue to get as much insight at a grassroots level as we can to support our strategy development and solutions moving forward.
And Josh, if I could just chime in, because I saw kind of a draft of the site, and my conditioned response was, that doesn't look Ramsey County bureaucratic. And then I thought, oh good, we might actually get some genuine feedback. So you're going to see it. It's very clean and crisp, and I think very just easy to navigate. And so I'm really excited about the type of information that will yield, because I think across all of our agencies, we've been doing a significant amount of engagement and feedback, and it typically looks very bureaucratic. And so as not to fatigue our community with more engagement, I think that this is a really, really great platform to have them engage as much or as little as they want, but be able to provide feedback in a really comfortable space. So I'm really excited about this part.
Awesome. If you all have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. We're happy to answer some as we go along here. But thanks again, Denitric, for laying out the community engagement plan as it stands. Cool. So we're going to shift gears once more. The next hour of this conversation will really be around housing. Before we get to this housing section, a few key housekeepings. We will walk through the entire data slides prior to opening up for questions. If you have a question, you can place them in the chat box once again, and reference the slide number if you have. They're at the bottom right hand of your screen. That way we can make sure we refer to them when we do address that question. There could be some questions we can answer real time in a chat box, others that we will just hold until the end of that presentation. And secondly, if you still haven't filled out the form to put yourself in a breakout group, I'm gonna ask Christina if she would link it in the chat box once more, so you can have access to that. And we'll break out into groups in about 25 minutes or so. So Jerry Paytas is our Vice President for Research and Analytics here at Fourth Economy, and he's been taking the lead on some of our housing analysis and an approach to developing a needs assessment. So I'm going to turn it over to him to walk you through the slides.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I have that bad habit of talking while I'm still on mute, so I'm glad I didn't do that this time. And don't worry, I won't be talking for an entire hour about all this data. Josh, can you take us to the next slide? So the first I have to start off with a caveat. We are acutely aware that everything we've analyzed to date reflects the circumstances pre-COVID. We are tracking how this is going to impact these trends and what our assumptions are related to housing, but there are many unknowns and few precedents for this. But we do know that all these pressures on affordability, the supply of affordable units, the various racial and ethnic disparities, and the public resources to fund supply are all going to be strained due to this crisis. So this is very much sort of, a baseline for where things were before this crisis. I'm going to go over some of the key just highlight findings from our needs assessment and the housing analysis. So pre-COVID, the housing trends, we had rents increasing across Ramsey County by generally more than 8%. Home values have also been increasing, but not as rapidly. Josh? So on the home values here, most of the communities are increasing by 10% or more. And we have a few communities that have increased by less than 5%, but it's really only 2 of them. And then you have a few of these communities out here, such as North Oaks, with extremely high values and increasing by 17%. Most of the communities are clustered here with a median housing value at a minimum around $200,000. Next. Take a look at rents. And in this slide, we excluded North Oaks and Gem Lake. They're simply such outliers that it's impossible to see the rest of them with those 2 communities. Gem Lake also only has 22 rental units, so it's really, there's not much to say about what trends are happening there. Their rents are just under $1,400, and they've been decreasing, but with only 22 units, there's not much to say about that. North Oaks, the rents are above $2,700 and increasing by 35%. But generally what we see is for rents, many of the communities are not affordable for people with lower incomes, and especially for minorities. And even here, minimum increase of 8% in rents, and we have, median rents well over $1,000 per month. Next slide, Josh. So in terms of the cost burdens, most of the minority cost burden households are all earning below 50% of the area median income. And minority renters overall are the most likely to be cost burdened. So here we can see with 67,000 cost burdened households in Ramsey County, we've got about 49,000 of those households are all below 50% of the area median income. And the majority of these are renters. As we shift above the 50% AMI, it starts to become a majority. The burden is on owners, but the numbers are still dwarfed by this very large number of renters at below 30% AMI and between 31 to 50% AMI. Now, St. Paul also has the majority of the cost burdened households, and it has more of them than the rest of Ramsey County. We can go to the next slide. So if we start to look at this in terms of race and ethnicity, we can see all these households here at the 30% and below and 31 to 50%, this concentration of the cost burden on the lowest income households. In terms of sheer numbers, most of these are white households. But in terms of where the disparity falls, the minority households are most likely to be in this below 50% of the area median income. And while a lot of these households are in St. Paul, this isn't purely a St. Paul problem. For example, 48% of the African American households outside of St. Paul are cost burdened, but they're only 4% of all the cost burdened households in Ramsey County. Go to the next one. Thank you, Josh. Now, if we look at this in terms of the income levels, and the census data doesn't always align very well with the HUD AMI levels, but these very roughly correspond. So the 30% AMI is 25,750. The 50% is 42,000. And then we also have here how much the housing cost, whether it is the monthly homeowner costs or a monthly rental cost, 30% of their monthly income. For those less than $25,000 to $625, and so on. So we have a lot of these households here. African American households, particularly clustered in earning less than $25,000. Hispanic households are really kind of equally distributed across this income spectrum. The Asian households are a little more clustered in the 75,000 and above. Next slide. And those income disparities, which are related to the kinds of jobs that are being created, the transportation costs imposed by where those jobs are, really drives an unequal housing opportunity. So across Ramsey County, the median rent is $969. So that means half of the apartments cost more and half of them cost less. So for half of the African American households, they're well below what the median rent is in Ramsey County, which really creates a disparity in access to housing. There are numbers for the Native American communities. Here, I only concentrated on the largest minority categories, but we can provide those numbers in the more detailed report. Josh, let's go to the next slide. So overall, what we see right now, the biggest need is affordable rental units at 30% AMI. And there's an overall gap of about 15,000 units at this price point. But when you consider households that need a 2-bedroom or larger unit, that's going to drive that gap even further. Let's go to the next slide. So if we look at the households that have a cost burden as a share of total households, and that cost burden, is defined as a household spending more than 30% of their income on their housing costs. It's not including the transportation cost. That's an additional burden that's not considered in these numbers. But we can see that overwhelmingly, the cost burden falls on renters. Nearly half of all renter households are cost burdened. For homeowners, it's less than 20% of the homeowners are cost burdened. And for some of those owners, that 30% may be driven by housing choice more so than by an actual cost burden. It may also reflect older residents whose income have declined, but have really already managed to pay for their houses. If we can go to the next slide. So if we look specifically at the renter cost burden, this 40,000 plus renters in Ramsey County, a lot of this burden is not seniors. This is on the working population. So this is really reflective of the kind of jobs that are being created, as well as the supply and affordability of housing. It's about 80% of the cost burdened houses are working age. And 93% of the cost burdened renters earn less than $50,000. We'll see in a minute, most of the 2-bedroom units cost $750 a month. Now, if you're making less than $50,000, less than $25,000, that's going to be real hard to afford that. If we can go to the next slide. So looking at those rental units by how large they are in terms of the number of bedrooms, there's a very limited supply of the larger units. of 2 and 3 bedroom units. You have fewer than 15,000 units have 3 or more bedrooms. So regardless of affordability, that limited supply is going to be a constraint, especially if we have more households, as we were discussing earlier. Households in the last recession that through foreclosure and quick sales got forced into renting, they may need a larger rental property. There simply won't be the supply to accommodate those households. If we can go to the next. This just gives us a look at what the rents are for these different sized units. So if you're a renter household that needs a 2 or 3 bedroom unit, you're really looking at $750 a month or more. If you need a 3 bedroom unit, there's almost all the supply is above $1,000 a month. So this creates the need for much greater supply and much greater subsidy. We also know that affordable housing production is simply not keeping pace with the county's current and future needs. Next slide. So if we look at the Metropolitan Council's household forecast, for the entire 7-county region, the population is going to grow to just under 600,000 by 2040. And in terms of the number of households, it's going to be getting close to 250,000 households. In Ramsey County, that means 22,610 new households, bringing it almost to a total of 250,000 households. So that's going to add a lot more population, and given the income distribution, it's going to be a lot more need for housing units at those lower price points. We don't know entirely what the current health and economic crisis, what impact that will have, but we do expect that it's going to further reduce the supply of housing. It may reduce some of the housing prices and rent prices, but that is unlikely to make up for the lost income and earnings that people are suffering at this current time. If we can go to the next slide. When we look across where growth is happening in St. Paul, and again, taking these Metropolitan Council projections and looking at where household growth is going to increase and employment growth is going to increase, we've excluded St. Paul from this slide, again, because of the scale. St. Paul is going to add more than 12,000 new households and nearly 19,000 jobs by 2040. But we see a lot of other communities with some significant growth in households and growth in employment. And how this lines up with the transit and transportation systems and the location of affordable housing and the location of social and support services is going to be critical to this plan. We go to the next slide. These are just the communities that are going to see lower levels of growth. And we still see a number of these communities, with significant employment growth, given what we know about the jobs that are being created across the country and in Ramsey County. A lot of these are going to be jobs that don't pay as well. So what's going to be the right mix of housing and transit? Do we make sure that if we focus purely on just reducing the housing cost burden, it doesn't come at the expense of increased transportation costs, both the hard costs and people's time? Josh, we can go to the next one. So the total affordable units in Ramsey County in terms of owner and renter units by income level, we already know there's some insufficient number of units, there's gaps. In the last recession, the production of affordable units collapsed. Since 2010, the annual average, the Ramsey County's had an annual average of about 1,300 affordable units being produced each year. For the last recession, that collapsed to 500 units. It's highly likely that this crisis will cause an even deeper collapse in that production. What we really have, this is where we have a big problem in the lack of supply with all the households at 30% AMI. Once you start getting above here, the gaps aren't looking as bad. We go to the next slide. And this one, while it's not very visually appealing, it really highlights and brings together the number of households and the number of housing units at each of these income levels. So what we see here, this is that 15,000 gap in the housing supply. But there's some surpluses at these higher income levels at 31 to 50%. So part of this is a supply problem, part of this is the low wage jobs problem, and part of this is a subsidy problem. Now, as Ramsey adds those 22,000 plus new households, that's going to increase the burden here. So based on that projected growth, Ramsey's going to add about 9,000 more households that are earning less than 50,000. So about 4,200 more households that earn less than 25,000. About 5,000 that earn 25 to 49,000. Another 4,000 in that 50 to 74,000 range, and 10,000 households earning 75K and above. And somebody mentioned here, Libby Starling mentioned, don't forget the other mismatch issues. Yeah, many affordable housing units can be occupied by households earning higher incomes, and they can outbid those households for those incomes. So not addressing the supply problems is not an option. Any other questions?
Jerry, I think there was a question earlier, I think related to your cost burden slides, whether or not there were numbers for Native American communities. You may or may not have addressed that, but just wanted to call it out.
We do have the number, and I can, I might be able to look it up and chat it in here.
Any other questions that you have, or any initial thoughts that come about in terms of the data that was just presented? Feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask the question. We'll give it a few minutes for open discussion before we break off into our groups. Okay. So there are two things that we hope to get accomplished with this data. One, take a little bit more of a deeper dive into what this means, or what these numbers mean per community and per city. So one of the conversations that we want to have is to take a look at those communities. What's driving growth in those communities? How are they responding to their housing needs? What are those barriers that exist that can hinder development of housing and preserving housing? And again, this conversation will be super important as we kind of think about where to focus the conversation with housing partners in our housing working group. And then secondly, we are going to continue to build out some details around what's needed in terms of housing and units in the next few years. And we need to begin to build out some assumptions of what the market will look like. So we want to workshop for the next 20 minutes what those scenarios might be to better inform our analysis as we move forward. So any additional questions that you might have, happy to address them in the small groups. Maria Zimmerman, who is part of the consultant team, will facilitate that first group. Then I will facilitate the second group. So at any point that you're ready, Merdalis, we can go ahead and just break up into smaller groups.
Hey, I'm just missing a couple people, so I'm just wondering if they just did not have a preference and I should add them at random.
Yes, just go ahead and do that, Merdalis.
Awesome. All right, opening the rooms right now.
So you should get an invite on your screen telling you to join a breakout room if you could accept that when you see it.
Mid-sentence there by the commissioner, but thank you all for that.
Same
Thank
here.
you, Martha, for helping to take notes here. Lots of good stuff that came up.
Max, if you wouldn't mind putting your last thoughts in the chat box or shoot me a quick email, I want to make sure we capture it.
And I think I had pretty much completed my thoughts anyway. It's all tied together. That's what it comes down to.
We just had that same similar conversation.
Cool. I think everyone's back into the main room. So again, thank you all for taking the time out of your day to talk to us. I think we had a pretty robust conversation in our small group. I hope, Maria, that the conversation in your group was the same. We're going to kind of compile these thoughts and we'll share them out to you all so you can add as you see fit. But I think we're in a good place to prepare not only for our working groups with the housing partners, but also to deepen our analysis as we move along. So thanks again. I do want to give the floor to Carrie or Tawana or Martha for kind of final thoughts or comments before we close out.
I'll just jump in and say thank you all for taking 2 hours out of your Friday afternoon to talk about some pretty heavy stuff. I know we're standing in between you and a virtual happy hour, so we'll let you take off. But thanks again, because this is really important work, as you all are leaders in this work, and I can't thank you enough for carving out time to make this happen.
I would echo the same. Thank you. Really substantive conversations. If you have follow-up thoughts that come to mind, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. We really want to have you engaged and leading in this work. And the same goes as we start the community engagement. I know there was a question about who would be serving on those work groups and task forces, and we're community representatives, so we'll be sure to share those lists out with you so you're aware of those folks. But please do provide what you're hearing out in communities, and in particular, if you have ideas about ways that we can be sure that we hear from as many folks as possible with those surveys. Once you get those links, please share as much with us as you can, because we want to be sure that we reach people in any way possible. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think we can all close out. Thank you guys again.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest
Great
of
meeting.
your weekend.
Well done, Josh and team, and Tawana. Thank you.
Go team.